fantastic seeing so many people here. I'm really excited about being able to talk to you all about place names today. It's kind of odd because the only physical audience I really have is a disinterested looking cat. So I guess I'll use this opportunity as well to apologize in advance if Marlo decides that he wants to steal the limelight. If anything random happens, like I suddenly type random characters into the chat or a great void of darkness comes in front of the webcam, that will be him announcing his presence. So it is 2 o'clock. So without further ado, mainly because I'm quite excited about it, welcome to today's talk on place names as an edible encyclopedia. And there's a little hint here on what sort of thing I'll be talking about later, but we're going to talk rather generally about names to begin with. And talk generally about what's in a name. Now, anyone who's dabbled at all in onomastics, the study of names, place names, animal names, people names, will be fed up with that Shakespeare quote because every onomast ever uses Shakespeare's what's in a name. And yet it so handily encapsulates the sort of starting foundational questions that we need to address before we get into any details here of, well, what information is there in a name? And all of it stems from the important point that might be very, very obvious, but is sometimes overlooked, that names are all social conventions. They all represent a social contract that people in smaller groups and then cascading up into large groups have mutually agreed that this series of words or this series of sounds are going to denote a particular place or a particular type of animal. And often when things are getting their names, there are several possible names in competition, and then one wins out because it's somehow more relevant or somehow more informative. And what that relevance or what information is in that name varies depending on the culture, depending on cultural values, depending on what's important. So in personal names, often it is social issues like religiousness, representing certain types of religious identity, or embodying certain sorts of characteristics. So we take a look at Western naming conventions for people, and you get lots of biblical names because historically that was the identity of the European world. And we also get lots of these Germanic names that represent all sorts of heroic values. So my name, Eric, comes from the Old Norse Eirikur, meaning eternal ruler or ruler of all time, i.e. someone who aspires to be a ruler that's commemorated for all time. Richherd means strong and powerful. So again, kind of embodying these qualities that they wanted their children to grow up with. Now, place names are quite interesting because sometimes they reflect these cultural values, but often they're designed to be, and I say design in the loosest sense, but they're designed to be self-identifying or self-informative, that you give somewhere a name and there's enough information in that name that people can then decide, do I bother making the trek over there or not? So one of the main things they do is they share geographic knowledge. This is usually the second element of a name, what we'll call the topographic generic if we're using onomastic terms, or if we're not, just the second element. And this generally tells us about what kind of place it is. So we look at a place like Winchester, and the second element, Chester, tells us that it was a market town, that it was all about buying and selling. So we look at any name around the country, they're going to have generally the second element that tells us about what it does geographically. Is it a hill? Is it a lake? Is it a mare? Is it a field? And so on. And then the first bit tends to describe it some way. We'll call this the topographic specific in onomastic terms. But it tells us a little bit about what's special about this Chester, or this field, or this port, or this witch, or this town. So Southampton is the southern town that belongs, I think it was originally from someone called Hammer, but I'll have to double check. It might just be the southern settlement town, the Southampton. This brings us to another issue, however, which is that in order to identify what a place name actually comes from, we need to go very, very early. We need to find the first time we ever have a place name recorded, and then we can try and work out what the early form was. One of the issues we have is that as time goes on and people recycle names, they kind of lose their original meaning, and this means that we can take little phonetic shortcuts, pronounce them differently, or we might have folk analogy, and people might interpret the different elements differently. So I'm going to give some general examples here on the screen for some of the social conventions that go into naming and what they tell us about its geographic nature and its functional nature. Now, I spoke about the place Week last year, sometimes known as Beauworth, that's its full name. And here on a 1645 map, we have the part of Winchester known as Week listed here as Beauworth. And its name means the witch, the settlement, the village that is in a beo-wyrð, a forest. So we've got the topographic generic. It is a witch, it is a little settled land. And then we've got the first bit, the beo-wyrð, the fact that it is in, as you can see on this 1645 map, in an area once known as the West Forest, also known as the West Bear Forest historically. Now, sometimes the specific can tell us who this land belonged to. So King Sombornes, which is also just over here, belonged to the king. We find the earliest spelling of it in 1285, which is Kinga Somborna, and that is already a contraction of swine and burna. Swine is the word for swine, pig. Burna is a stream. So this is a stream, we'll come back to this in a little bit. This is a stream where pigs were allowed to graze, were taken to pasture, and it was specifically the bit that belonged to the king, as opposed to Upper Somborne or Little Somborne. We have Bishopstoke, again, keeping most of these relatively local to Winchester, which was originally sometimes known as Stoker, which means a place, a fenced-off area belonging to someone, and it belongs to a bishop. Sometimes we got it as Stocker Episcopi, where they understood it was the place and then mentioned bishops in Latin. And sometimes the people it belonged to didn't have a notable social role. So Tadley was originally Tadan-leah, which means the wood or clearing belonging to a man called Tada. Who this Tada is, he hasn't really left any real historic imprint, but clearly he was important at some point because people referring to Tadley had to reference the fact that this wooded clearing belonged to Tada. Now, this specific can not just be who owns it or who has power over it, but also what sort of things live there. So Hawkley, again, kind of local, comes from the word hawk, which is still preserved today, Old English hafok, and lair, that wooded clearing. Bramshott comes from brembels-sceat. So sceat is just a level area of land with brambles, with blackberry brambles. So it was named this way because people wanted to share knowledge that this is a fairly easy to traverse bit of land, and it's worth going to because you can forage blackberries there. There's something interesting that you'll want from it. And this brings us already to, I'll answer questions at the end, but please do feel free to stick them in into the chat and I'll address them at the end. So this brings us to naming things for natural resources that are available. And the sorts of resources you might name it for might be food, like Bramshott or Appleshaw, which comes from the word apple, and Sjaga, a sort of shady woodland. Cheriton might come from the Old English Cherryston, so the town that had some cherry farms in it. This would be kind of unusual to have cherries sort of so cultivated at such an early period, but not unheard of. We do have Old English texts that mention the import of cherries from the rest of Europe. Far more certain one that shows just how weird the resources could be is nettle den. Now, we might not think of stinging nettles as a resource today, although if you drink nettle tea, maybe you do. But back in the early Middle Ages, this was a fairly common source of food. It was a fairly common condiment. And so somewhere like nettle denner comes from an early net-leah denner, which is the nettle wooded clearing in a valley. So it's a valley, you know that you're getting to the valley, then you're looking for a wooded clearing, and it will be filled with nettles that you can use for medical purposes as well as a condiment. Now, today we might also overlook the fact that most of the place names with tree names with wooded elements in them were also indicating resources. As Westow Anglo-Saxon village over here rather handily encapsulates, they needed certain types of wood for building their houses, they needed thatch for their roofs, they needed thin withy type sticks to make their fences out of. And so codifying what kind of tree it is really quite helpful in terms of defining its usefulness. So Lyndhurst in our neck of woods in Hampshire comes from the word lind, which today references the linden tree. In Old English, it was much more general, and it could refer to the linden or the lime tree. And Hurst is a forest. So this is a place where there's lots and lots of the tree known as lind. Now, the main use of lind, the wood known as lind in Old English, lindena, to say it's made from lind, was to make shields. So if you are aware of the famous Sutton Hoo burial, that magnificent early medieval burial in East Anglia that has the beautiful, majestic helmet, that had a huge ornate shield that was made out of lind and out of lime tree. And indeed, when we look at the Old English poetry, they constantly talk about linden shields, shields made out of the lime tree. So this was clearly named for the fact that it was a useful spot for collecting wood for making weapons. And a similar thing may underlie sparsholt. The second element is definitely holt, which means a wood, but the first element, spares, is a little bit disputed. We don't have spare with this spelling attested in Old English. We only have it attested from the 12th century onwards, so about 2 centuries after Old English changed into Middle English, to oversimplify things in the interests of time. And this spar may be the word that today survives as spar, like the long sort of sticks that people use for building fences and also as poles in ships. So that might reference a forest that was particularly useful for getting these spars from, but there are other possibilities too, given the vowel. It might be the wood of sparrowhawks or the wood of sparrows, but then we, in the case of sparrows, we have to beg the question, well, why did they care about a wood filled with sparrows when those weren't particularly used? Sparrowhawks we will come back to later. So basically every name fulfills some sort of function, even somewhere like London, which doesn't easily look like it fulfills some sort of function. It ultimately comes back from a Brythonic root, ploa, meaning a place where water flows, i.e. a really good place to build a settlement. And we can see just how good a place it was to build a settlement from the fact that Brythonic settlers lived there, and then the Romans lived there, and then the Anglo-Saxons lived there, and then when Canute, the Danish emperor, took over England in 1016, he lived there, and then, well, lots of people live there today. Now, there are some other ways in which we can see these names being used to codify these places as areas that are relevant for food and for eating. So not just saying this is a forest for lind, or that this is an area where you can forage blackberries. And so we'll come to the Sombornes here, and we can be sure to answer Nicola's question, how can we be sure that the Sombit is a contraction of swina, is because the other Sombornes, we have swin-burn, and then this is what's known as a sound change. As people say words more and more and more, they shortcut it. So the reason we say sword today without the W in it is because we want to shortcut it, whereas it used to be pronounced sword, and before that it was pronounced swayord. So King Somborne, we know was definitely swina because we had lower Somborne, or Pava swinburn, the little swine's brook, and we also had Upan or Hea, the upper or the higher swine brook, the swine stream. So because of its location, we can be very sure there. And these denote places where pigs were taken to pasture. And this is something that might surprise people today, given that we don't generally think of pigs as pasture animals. Again, depending on where you're from, you might recognize the use of taking pigs out to pasture. But in the early medieval worlds, this was standard practice. Part of the reason that pigs were so cheap to raise compared to something like horses or cows is the fact that you could take them out for very, very mobile pasture. So we have these swine brooks all across the country. So there is Swinbrook in Oxfordshire or Swindale Beck in Cumbria, and they all replicate the same kind of pattern that we see in Upper Lower King Somborne of denoting a body of water where you can take your pigs out to pasture. We also get quite a lot of pasture woods, which again tells us we don't get too many documents about pig farming from the early medieval world. A lot of it has been reconstructed from place names, and places like Swinscoe in Staffordshire, which comes from swin, the Old English word for pig, plus the Norse word for forest, skogr. So this is the forest where you take your pigs. And then we've got the lost place names. Now, these are kind of heartbreaking, and we get them in various documents, usually things called charters, which are recording land grants, saying King so-and-so gives this land to so-and-so, and here's a demarcation of the boundaries, or the church gives this land to someone, or the church receives it. Basically an early form of deed. And we get in places little mentions of various denbera, these wine pasture forests. So den was a very specific word meaning swine pasture. Bera is the same word we've actually already seen in Beauworth to refer to a forest. Swinhagen, which are swine enclosures, and hlos, which is a sort of pigsty. And these tended to be on the borders of people's lands, which in and of itself is quite interesting because it suggests that these were areas which everybody could access. They're not within people's lands, they are at the boundary of them, and therefore there is public right of way into them. And so what they end up codifying is that for the man, woman, child on the street, this is a good place to bring pigs to drink water. This is a good place to bring pigs to eat in woods. This is a good area for having your pigs graze in the forest. Now we've got two other terms here, the swinhagen and the hlos, which actually show that there's a difference between where pigs were taken out for pasture and where they were often left overnight or where they were left for longer periods of time. So we get numerous swinhagen, these numerous swine enclosures, really difficult to identify where they would have been exactly today because it requires us to identify other uncertain points. But even from the name alone, we can see that there's a clear delineation between where you left your pigs overnight and the places that you take them out to graze. And the same for the pigsties, which were often on bodies of water so that your pigs, you could either have irrigation from the bodies of water, or so the pigs could go rustle about in that water. It might be easy to overlook just how valuable pigs were as a food source because they would eat basically anything, because they don't take a huge amount of maintenance, unlike sheep, which you constantly have to shear, because they're not they don't have other functions like horses, which you can ride, or cows, where the skin was used to make manuscripts. So they're a fairly good choice of animal if you were lower down in society and you just wanted to make a living, you wanted to generate some food for yourself, and you wanted to be able to sell the excess to other people. We can see just how much the law respected it in the earlier period if we look at something like the laws of Ina, which were written down some point between 688 and 694. And one of the laws says that if anyone cuts down a tree that can shelter 30 swine, then that person shall pay 60 shillings. Now that sounds like a big number, and it is quite a big number, but to give you a sense of how big that number is, that's exactly the same amount of money you'd pay in compensation for killing somebody's slave. You'd give them 60 shillings. If you're caught working on a Sunday in the laws of Ina, the fine was 15 shillings. So hopefully that gives a sense of just how much this would have been worth. The penalty for killing a free man or a noble was 120 shillings upwards. And if you started a fight in a church, the price was 120 shillings, whereas if you started a fight in a noble's house, it was 60 shillings. So 60 shillings is a lot and gives us a sense of just how respected pig cultivation was and how important they found these trees for sheltering pigs. So these aren't just any old forests. These aren't just any old trees that you can take your pigs out to for wood pasture. And that gives us a sense of why specific woods like Swinscoe were identified as appropriate places to farm your pigs. Also, interestingly, if we take a look at Somborne Parva here, the little Somborne, Upper Somborne up here, and King Somborne down here, we can see the rich woodland around them. And I always like this little detail from Christopher Saxon's map. You can see the enclosure running around the king's wood pasture as opposed to the common wood pastures. Now, pigs aren't the only animals that need keeping and looking after, and they're not the only animals that we can get onomastic information about this. Rather than go through every single sort of animal systemically, I'm going to cherry pick the most interesting ones. And I think bees are especially interesting because we get two types of names, a little bit like we got with the pig pastures. We get names that indicate where bees were kept, and we have names that indicate where you would find bees. So somewhere like Beauworth in Hampshire comes from beo and wyrth, an enclosure for bees. This is a specialised beekeeping place, and it was named as such so that everyone would know this is a place that keeps bees. If you want honey, this is the place to go to buy it. We see a number of other similar formations. So Bickerston in Norfolk comes from an other word for bee in Old English, bicera or bicera, depending on the dialect. So this is a town, a settlement with bees in it. Again, this is a specialized, it's called a town, it's called a settlement, it's called an enclosure because lots and lots of bees live there. People live there too. This is a place where bees are looked after by people. We get Bickertons in Cheshire, Herefordshire, Northumberland, and West Yorkshire. We get Beeby in Leicestershire, which is a bee settlement using an Old Norse last bit, bu. We've got Beckett in Berkshire, which is a bee cottage, so less settled than, say, Bickerston or Beeby, but perhaps about the same number of people as Beauworth. And Berwick in Northumberland and East Yorkshire, which again are these wicks tend to be very specific trade-oriented settlements. So this was a trade settlement where bees were kept and where merchants who are traveling could easily buy honey. Now we get lots of other bee names in the landscape, and they tend to tell us about where bees were caught. Bickley is the clearing in a wood where you could find bees. Bickershaw is a shaded bit of wood where you can find bees. Bickerthwaite is using the Old Norse veit, a clearing where you could find bees. And then we get a lot of permutations of beo-leah, the clearing, the wooded clearing. Leah is a very specific sort of clearing in a wood. In Beaulieu in Worcestershire, Beaulieu in Dorset, and Billow in Gloucestershire. Now, all of these tend to be rather far from settlements, so it doesn't seem very likely that these were places where bees were kept, where somebody would have to navigate miles and miles and miles away from their hamlets in order to attend to their bees and then to sell honey from their bees. We see, just like with the previous names, we get this distinction between where you buy, sell, where you encounter them, and where they are acquired. And we've actually got a little bit of textual evidence that shows us that early medieval speakers were rather concerned about acquiring bees and then bringing them back to their settlements. That sheds also a little bit of light on how they did so. Now, this is what's sometimes known as a charm, sometimes called with imber, against a swarm of bees. And what's especially interesting about this is that it's sort of noted down as somebody's spare notes. So here we have the manuscript of the Old English translation of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. And clearly lots and lots of money went into this, because look at how much space there is, look at how beautiful the writing is. This is quite a sizable manuscript too. They didn't cheap out the scribe writes beautifully in this. Now that scribe also put some of their own things in the sides. Sometimes these were references to texts that are noted in the main body of the ecclesiastical history. But in this case, it's sort of, I want to record this. I can't justify the money to buy some parchment or some vellum to record this. So I'm just going to note it in the sides of a project I've already got. And this is where we tend to find most of our superstitious material preserved from the early Middle Ages, where monks and nuns who are superstitious and were writing these very high prestige ecclesiastical texts then made little notes in the side so that they could keep it for posterity pass on. And here it says, with imber, some of it's in poetic form that you're meant to speak out, some of it's instructions. And it begins with a little instruction, with imber, nim erthan, offerweb mit thinra swithenhanda, under thinum swithran fet, and quet. So against a swarm of bees, take some earth, throw it with your right hand under your right foot, and then say the following. Fo ich underfoot, funde ich hit. Whet earth may with era wichte je welcha, and with andan and with eminder and with the Michelan mandas tungan. So I have taken it underfoot. I have found this thing here. Behold, earth can overcome all the creatures and all enmity and all apathy, and even overcome the speech of the greatest men. This is a biblical thing, because remember, earth is what Adam is made out from. Earth is what people go to in the end when they die. And then there's a little bit of instructions. And with on forwerp offerkreot, thon hiswaman and queth. And then take that earth that you've just put under your foot, throw it over to where they are swarming, and then say the following. Sit ye sihuef sigath to earthan, nefer ye wilda to wooda fleogan. Beo ye swa ye mindi minas godas, swabith mana hiwelcha, metas and ethelas. So sit you down, victory women, sink to the earth. Never will ye flee wild to the woods. Be as mindful of my needs, my goodness, as each man is of their food and of their homes. So what's interesting here is that this isn't a charm against a swarm to dispel it. This is a charm against a swarm of bees to get them to settle down on the ground so that they never go wild into the woods again, i.e. so that you can take them and then they can diligently work to give you food and money as each person works diligently to get their own food and lodgings. And as with a lot of these charms, there's usually some sort of evidential basis for it. And the evidential basis here is that if bees are attacked from the air, whether by words or by flinged bits of mud, they're going to settle down on the ground to avoid that aerial attack. And then they can use that to, say, get a blanket, put it over the bees, and then take them back to a hive that they've made beforehand. I see there's a question about whether it's to do with the left hand and the sign of the devil. It might be the right hand and right foot because left is bad, or it might be some other superstitious constructs that we don't have access to. There might have been something, there might have been some other charms that involved the right side that just haven't survived. So we have to be kind of cautious about that. But what we can be sure about is that capturing bees was really quite important to them. And in order to do so, we also have the clear distinction here that the bees, when they're wild, are in the woods, wilder to wooder fleogan, and when they're not wild, we put them in enclosures where they work for us and work alongside us. Now, while we've looked at places that are good for foraging, that are good for collecting berries, that are good for keeping bees and for finding bees, there are also some cautionary place names. Some of these relate to pests, some of these relate to slightly more terrifying entities. So we've lost quite a few of these. Again, they're in these boundary charters that are at the perimeter of land given by the king to church, or by the church to king, or by one of those two parties to noblemen. And we get a wyvelesden, which is a lake with weevils, a wyvelesden, a stile or a pass that's got weevils, and wyvelesden, a valley filled with weevils. And they've articulated these places as things you don't want to bother with. So don't bother trying to wash your fruit and vegetable or get irrigation from wyvelesden. It's filled with weevils. Go find a different body of water. Don't try and plant things in wyvelesden. There are weevils everywhere. Avoid it. And we see this pattern replicated in names that survive today, like Wigmore in Devon. Again, don't irrigate your land with this. Weevils Field in Sussex. Again, don't bother trying to grow things in Weevils Field. There's only one way that this can end up. Latchmore in Surrey and Latchmore in Dorset, which are both the lakes with leeches in them. Don't go swimming in there. Snailwell in Cambridgeshire. Don't irrigate your land using this. And if anyone's a watercress aficionado, one of the main things you have to worry about with watercress is not taking watercress below the water level, because then there are snails. Snails lay their eggs in it, and those eggs are parasitic. And normally what happens is that cows eat it, and then the snails grow inside the cows, and then they move out of the cows, and then woo, they're in a nice nutrient-rich surrounding where they can then develop and grow, but not ideal for people. So they might have articulated snail well as don't take any food, any vegetation from below the water level here, as well as don't irrigate from it. We also get gadflies and gnats articulated as general nuisances. So Bochum in Devon, this is a valley filled with gadflies. Don't take your animals there, because then they're going to get infected, and because gadflies have a nasty habit of laying their eggs in animals, usually horses, and in people too. My apologies if anyone has had to deal with a gadfly infestation before. And Natham in Devon, which is the hemmed-in land that is filled with gnats. Don't bother doing anything here, you're just going to get overwhelmed. Some of them are kind of cautionary in that way. Don't try doing food here, food-related things here. It's not going to pan out. And some places seem to be, don't go there because you will become food. Now, they're overlaid with various degrees of superstition. So we've got lots of wolves' place names, and one of the difficulties with the wolves' place names, indeed, is that it can be problematic telling apart when a place is named after the animal wolf and when it's after the personal name wolf. So if we get something like Wolverhampton, that is the Ham town, that is the settlement town that belonged to a man called Wolf. Something like Wolvesey Castle, which was originally Wolvers-A, the marshy land of Wolf, is more difficult to figure out. Is this a marshy land that wolves would hunt in, and therefore you don't really want to do your own hunting there? Or is it that this was the marshy lands or an island? Actually, given the topography of Wolvesey Castle, it's almost definitely a marshy land belonging to a man called Wolf. We don't have enough evidence to know. So I've flagged up Wolvesey Castle as a tentative. Maybe this reflects wolves, maybe it doesn't. More certainly are Grendel's mares. We get two of these, one in Worcestershire and one in Wiltshire. They're now lost. We don't know where these places are today. But in the Old English Charter documents, these indicated places on people's land boundaries that were named after the monster in Beowulf. So if you've not read Beowulf, I'm going to spoil at least the first bit of it for you, which is that Beowulf goes to help a place called Heorot because it's under attack from a monster named Grendel, who keeps breaking into the hall, tearing people apart, taking them out to eat. And then we've got two Grendel's mares in the Old English countryside, which might indicate a real fear that these creatures lived out there and that these were lakes to be avoided. We also get quite a number of dragon place names, like Drakelow in Derbyshire, which is the mound of a dragon. So this might be a superstitious thing, that they just wanted to keep people away from a mound that they didn't like, and so they say it's a mound of a dragon, or there was a genuine vernacular belief that a dragon lived in that mound or once lived in that mound that deserved commemoration. One of the frustrating things about working with place names alone is that sometimes, like Draculo, we don't have any other context for it. We can see what it clearly comes from, we can see what it means and what it must have meant, but we can't always access completely what story lies behind it. And I'm not going to say that that's not invaluable, because it is, knowing that these things existed, but it means we do have to be careful and we have to entertain various possibilities, just like with Wolvesey Castle. Is it a man called Wolf that owns that marshland, or is it a marshland that wolves would habitate? Now, I'm going to move from all of these, which were far more situated in looking at individual places and their stories, to looking at names as a whole and seeing what they can tell us about them. And this is based on a piece that I've published a couple of years ago. I'm happy to give people copies if they ping me an email, if you really want to read all 15,000 words. Otherwise, I'll kind of give you the headlines here, because when we look at the distribution of hawk and falcon place names that are definitely not to do with people. So this is, I've taken out everything that's a town, for example. Some very interesting patterns emerge, and this tells us a lot about what form falconry took, or hunting with hawks. I'm not going to distinguish between hawking and falconry or hawks and falcons, because early medieval English speakers didn't distinguish between them either. So I'll just use hawking and falconry interchangeably. So here is every place that we have a charter recorded from early medieval England, and here are all the places that mention hawks. What we'll see when we look at the big picture is that they generally conform to certain geographies. So we get quite a few streams that are hawk streams, so Hafok Will, for example. We get a few Hafok Link, a ridge, and usually these are elevated bits of land. These are all bits of land which we can identify, by the way. So Hafok Link in Micheldever is a raised bit of land near woodland. Hafok Ridge, a ridge. A coombe, which is a valley that gently slopes, a ford, which is of course a body of water that you can cross, a thorn, which is a tree generally in Old English. It's the thorn tree, the hawthorn tree today, or llaw, a mound, which is generally a small hill. But if we put these into what sorts of environments they are, so if we abstract it even more and group together our watery bodies, our trees, our hills, we see that overwhelmingly most hawk and falcon names in early medieval England, most place names that mention them, are either hilly bodies or they are small and shallow bodies of water, which is kind of interesting in and of itself. And to reason out why, we're going to take a small excursion to look at birds. As an avid bird lover, I will always take any excursion to look at birds, but if anyone has a phobia of birds, or if anyone doesn't really care about birds, I apologize in advance. So into the birds we go. We've got a couple of species of birds of prey that we know archaeologically and from textual records were used for falconry or hawking in early medieval England. And they are the kestrel. They are, these are going clockwise from the top left. So that's a male kestrel in the top left. Then we've got a male sparrowhawk, top right. Then middle right, we've got a female goshawk. Admire her enormous size, as there she is over a duck. And then at the bottom, we've got peregrines, which Winchester locals should know very, very well, because we always have some on the cathedral. These are ones that we find in archaeological remains. These are the ones that we know for sure people were dealing with. There is one other, and I've put that in red in the bottom left, and that's the gerfalcon, which we don't actually have in the early archaeological records, but we know some people were dealing with, because these were the super expensive birds that the elites were buying from other countries. So these were the Ferraris of hunting animals. If you're a king, we have, for example, Boniface corresponding with kings saying that he will acquire these gerfalcons from them that you cannot get in England, and then trade them back to the kings in order to earn them a favor. And most of these birds have rather clear areas they like hunting in the wild. So a kestrel in the wild will generally hunt in fields or by motorways today, but they didn't have motorways in early medieval England. Sparrowhawks will generally hunt in forests, in woodland, or in back gardens, but again, that's anachronistic. Goshawks will hunt at bodies of water, but generally also prefer to hunt deep in woods. And peregrines, they will hunt anywhere. I don't think anyone I know has had the unfortunate luck of having one of the Winchester peregrines kill something in front of them, but it's only a matter of time because I've seen the aftermath of where the Winchester peregrines have hunted, and it's not pretty. Similarly, gerfalcons in the wild will hunt everywhere. And that seems to resonate a little bit awkwardly with this data, which is distinctly hilly and small bodies of water, which so far we've established goshawks will sometimes hunt at, and also peregrines will sometimes hunt at. But then why so disproportionate? Why do we only have 3 areas with trees named after hawks and falcons when all of them will hunt there, but we've got hills and small bodies of water named after them when there's nothing that conspicuous about them in their natural environment? Well, the reason for this is that these must have been, therefore, or skipped ahead a little bit, places where people would practice falconry or hunting with their hawks and falcons. Now, we know from later medieval treatises that the 2 favoured places for this are small and shallow bodies of water and hilly areas. Now, the reason they like hilly areas is that it's easier for you to see what the falcon is doing. Generally, the hawk or falcon will approach the bird, it will try and escape going up over the hill, and then you can watch it. This is also how in the later Middle Ages they do their big heron or crane hunts. You'd get them scared up the hill so that the only place they can go is directly upwards, and then you can watch the gerfalcon or peregrine falcon strike them out of the air. But generally, a hilly area also would allow you to use dogs, or if you're poor, and I flagged this up for a reason yourself, to chase the bird that you want to catch up the hill. It has nowhere else to go but up, and then it's easier for the hawks to catch them. Small bodies of water are very interesting because in the wild, these birds, goshawks and peregrines, will sometimes hunt at small bodies of water, but also at big bodies of water, like big lakes. So why we only get places with small bodies of water is essentially an insurance thing. If the worst happens and your bird gets into the water, if it's a small body of water, it's much easier for you to get in there and save your bird compared to if they are hunting a heron over a large lake. The bird falls into the lake, or it has its wing broken and it falls into the lake. That's a gone bird. That's a bird that's going to drown. And people like Frederick II of Hohenstaufen wrote quite extensively about why small bodies of water are much better for you to conduct your hawking and falconry in than large bodies of water, essentially because you can catch your birds again, or you can make sure they're safe if anything happens around a small body of water compared to a large one. Now, I mentioned the possibility that if you were poorer, you wouldn't have dogs to help you, you could do it yourself. And this is one of the main interesting things that these places tell us. Now, remember, all of these places are at the boundaries of land that are given either from the church to someone or by the king or from a member of the aristocracy to someone. So they are publicly accessible areas, this ridge of the hawk or this valley of the hawk. And one of the things that's really overlooked for the early medieval period is that everybody from any part of society seems to have been able to practice falconry. Lower down the social hierarchy, we have people who are practicing it for subsistence. And we know this from a document called Alfrich's Colloquy, where he went out and he interviewed various parts of society, and then he used their responses to generate essentially a little scholastic workbook that people could practice and learn their Old English and their Latin with. And his discussion with the fowler says, and I'll go straight to the interesting bit, how do you feed your hawks? They feed themselves and me in winter, and in spring I allow them to fly off into the woods, and I catch the young hawks in autumn and tame them then. The teacher asks, why do you allow the tamed ones to fly off? And he says, because I don't want to feed them in summer, they need to eat too much. this person cannot be a member of the aristocracy. If you're worried about feeding both yourself and your hawk over summer, you are not a member of the elite. You're cut from a lower part of society. And so we have this class of falconers and hawkers who were not part of the elite and were using these hawks to gather food for themselves, and were using these places as codified linguistic as signs to the landscape as to where the best places to hunt with them are, or in the case of the trees, the best place to catch them are. And we see other evidence for this in things like Alfred's soliloquies, written by the scholastic group collected by the King Alfred, not by King Alfred himself, where he says that each man desires, notice it's not each prince or each thane or each rich person, it's each man desires, after he has built any homestead with the assistance of the land granted by his lords, that he can remain there for some time to hunt and to fowl and fish, and in each way toil that granted property for himself, both in water and on land, until it's given permanently. So this isn't one of the landed aristocracy. This is someone working for lords who can get a little bit of land, and then they toil the land themselves. They don't get other people to do it. This is the sort of person, like the fowler here, who is capturing these hawks and using them to feed themselves. And we seem to have this distinction between the aristocratic elite falconers in manuscripts too. So here are two calendars. They come from the same source ultimately, but two manuscripts containing calendars. And they show for the August, I think it's the month of August, I'll double check, one falconer who is on his horse, and he's clearly an elite falconer. He's got his own horse and he's hunting his prey, his quarry from horseback. And then we have this falconer or hawker over here who's going about on foot. And we get later occurrences or describing the weird method of falconry and hawking conducted in England. Frederick II is fascinated by the fact that there are English falconers who go about on foot. They don't go about on horseback, and also they use whistles to call back their birds rather than laws. And we also get evidence from that here in this conversation where he says, how do you catch birds? Sometimes with whistling, sometimes with a hawk, sometimes with traps. So we've actually got two classes of falconers. That's kind of a distinction that's been lost because by the later Middle Ages, as this graph shows, hunting wild animals becomes so closely associated with the aristocracy and the elite. So all you need to pay attention to here are the big black lines. These are the bars showing relative frequency of wild birds, relative frequency of wild animals. And in the earlier period, look at how much more similar and how much more presence there is of these non-elite forms of hunting. So place names not only help furnish us with this evidence for an otherwise lost class of falconer or hawker, the one who is hunting for themselves, but they can also work with other types of evidence to help bear out how did they know where in the landscape to go. And these places which were at the perimeters of private land were free game for anybody to go there as long as you didn't cross into private land. So this brings us to the end of today's talk. I'll still gladly answer questions, but I'd just like to piece together some general thoughts here, which is that place names were an edible encyclopedia because they were signposts for where you could forage, where you could catch things, where you could hunt things, and where you could avoid things that either you didn't want your animals encountering or you didn't want to encounter. They reflected these early types of usage, these early forms of accessibility. Here is a clearing in the woods where you can catch bees, but here are the settlement places where they are domesticated is not the right word, but where they are farmed and where you can buy them. And we can see that place names are this valuable historic artifact that we should draw upon and engage with just as much as we do with textual sources or archaeology. So thank you very much for listening to my rambles, especially my rambles on falconry and hawking, which are very close to my heart. And I'll now gladly entertain questions. I see first, Catherine Millard has asked, do you have a book we can borrow from the library or intranet? I've got the chapter on the falconry or hawking, which I'm very, very happy to give away. If you just drop me an email, I'll happily send you PDFs of anything that I've written that might cater to your interests. Generally, names are still quite a new area, especially names being applied to historical study. So there's not a huge amount out there, but I can point you in the directions of some of the really formative scholars for this. John Baker, I pillaged his chapter from the Representing Beasts book. I'm happy to give links if people drop me emails. He wrote about insects in place names and how they reflect areas of usage as well as areas to avoid. And Della Hook, who has written a lot about place names in the Midlands, but also wrote about these monstrous place names and has written a lot about pigs. If anyone needs a reminder of my email, it's here on the slide, eric.lacey@winchester.ac.uk. Mike Cooper says, a wider general question on onomastics. Decades ago, I taught the A-level English language course and always began with a module on onomastics. Fantastic. I am so glad to hear that. Begin with people's names, and a useful mnemonic was flon. They'd fit into one of four types: F for family, L for location, O for occupation, or N for nickname. That mnemonic still for surnames broadly works, but there are a couple, there's a whole category missing from there that we don't get tremendously in English, but we get a lot outside of English, and that's the apotropaic category of names. These are names which are given to protect people from certain types of event. Now, the favorite example I'll always go to, because this is where I first encountered it, was at a conference where somebody was talking about Slavic surnames, and there was one Itelmaz from the 15th century, which means even the dogs don't want it, which sounds, I mean, it's just a comically awful surname. But the reasoning behind it was that if you call your family, even the dogs don't want it, then the wild dog, what you're essentially saying is that what we're hoping is that the wild dog populations don't bother with us because they don't even want to deal with, even the dogs don't want us. Go eat a juicier family, go eat another one. And we get other names like that quite commonly, not so often as surnames, but sometimes as surnames, which will mean things like stupid or ugly. And the idea is to protect them from being stupid or ugly when they grow up. I've just seen that there are some things in the chat as well as in the Q&A. Oh, thank you all very much for the signs of gratitude. That means a lot. One, New Hampshire is similar to Hampshire. Similarly, the name is, there was a lot of this naming things after the original. There's a brilliant skit by Mitchell and Webb where they're walking along the coastline of Australia, and one of them goes, "This reminds me of home." And he goes, "What, Wales, sir?" And the other one responds, "No, of course not North Wales. Don't be ridiculous. The Australian coastline is nothing like North Wales." And it's like, "South Wales, obviously." And, it only has to have the most passing resemblance for them to name it. So New York as an example, or New Zealand as a replacement for that part of Scandinavia. It's kind of hearkening back to the homeland. And that's a whole other part of name and naming that I couldn't even begin to touch on. Nicola asks, any hints on piecing together locations from charters? How long do we get ownership names persisting? So often ownership names will persist in garbled forms like Tadley. We also will find ownership names persisting in what we might call folk etymologized names. These are names where people have reinterpreted it so that it fits another word that they know. As for finding these in the landscape, there is no replacement for getting the charter, finding a location that you definitely know. So if it starts the land grant at, to give a local example, at the Abbey of Romsey, then go out to Romsey and just start walking and seeing, can you identify these landscape spots? Essentially, that's how pioneers of this field like Della Hook did their research. And we might still use Google Maps or SatNav today, or look back through Ordnance Survey charts or old maps like Saxton's or Blauer's to find these places. But there is no replacement for just knowing the lay of the land and getting a sense of, well, if I lived here, what direction looks the most like the high path? And then where would that take me to? Far from the settlement, is this a boundary line that someone 1,000 years ago could have walked? Because that was the point of these charter boundaries. Then we go for locations that are likely to survive, like hills, promontories, large standing stones. But it's quite a convoluted method. And so my main advice for getting into it is just visit the place, get a sense of its landscape. Mike Cooper asks, apotropaic, apotropaic. That is absolutely like the sorts of things to avoid vampires, like wearing the cross, like, oh, that's the example you gave, like throwing salt over your shoulder, like just general things to avoid bad luck. It's one of the more common ways that naming develops globally as well. And if we take a look at names and naming in contemporary, let's go for South Africa, or if we go for Kenya, we'll still see many of these apotropaic practices at work. As society gets more cushioned from the environment, we tend to get a dip in these apotropaic names. We know that there are names taken from British places. First, we've got Karen Harrison saying, use a term which I think was Brythonic, referring to a historic period. So Brythonic, Brythonic, is the sort of Celtic culture that was here before the Romans, and they spoke a language that was similar but not identical to Welsh. And so we generally use Brythonic to refer to those Britons who were here before the Romans and spoke a language that in Wales became Welsh, but in the south became Cornish. We know that there are names abroad taken from British places like New York. Beaulieu is the only name taken from French and used in the UK. The pronunciation of this bias causes laughter from. But so I've only ever seen that in writing. Is it pronounced a weird way? Is it pronounced like Beaulieu or something? We get a couple of other French places in the UK. There's a couple in East Yorkshire, for example. There's a couple down along the southern coast between here and Brighton, usually much smaller places. And we get quite a few of these French names from the Norman lords who are brought over by William the Conqueror and used to displace the early medieval English aristocracy. But they are they are relatively rare, and they are definitely unusual in that because they were brought into English, they get very anglicized. We've got a couple of other, we can compare this to words in English which were similarly borrowed from French and which we have anglicized, like the word regard, which was borrowed from French regard, and which we have changed the pronunciation of a little bit. Government is another example. Once words have been in English for long enough, we pronounce them as English words. Oh my, I see a couple of things in the chat which I missed. Who was Ian and what do we know about his laws? Ian was a king of Wessex, a very, very early king of Wessex. And we know his laws mainly because Alfred preserved them as a kind of appendix in his own laws. There's not much more that we know about Ina because he was so early. I'm still really touched by all the thank yous. That really means a lot to me. Thank you very much. More rugged and dramatic landscape at